Thank you. I'd like to introduce my distinguished panel. We're going to get started here right away. We're going to be talking about think tanks, which you all are very familiar with, and how they can best work together. We'll start furthest from me, Juan Soto. He's the international director of Disenso, which is attached to the Vox party in Spain. Closer to me is Marko, Milanovic, Litre. He wears many hats. He's the vice president of New Direction here. He's actually a member of the Croatian parliament, and he's co-founder of the Conservative Party in Croatia. So we'll have a very interesting discussion about how those things all work together. And closest to me is Stefan, and I'm going to botch your name, I'm so sorry, Aćimović.
Actually, that's pretty good.
Oh, really?
That's very good.
That is the Croatian pronunciation of his last name. He's the European Programs Director for Students for Liberty. And let me start out, thank you. Let me start out on our topic, think tanks. I want to know there's a lot of think tanks in Europe. America has the most think tanks, something like 1,600. We lose an election, we get a new think tank. That's the way it works. I think the Europeans are rapidly catching up. There are many of them, and there have been fewer historically, I think, on the conservative side. But there are some challenges, as we talked about in the last panel, of conservatives' philosophy across different think tanks. One, what are some of the biggest challenges for think tanks to work together, and how might we overcome them?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be at Think Tank Central again. One more year after Lisbon. Thank you also for staying in the room after such an interesting yet intense conversation we just had. So yesterday we discussed how conservatives should make the case for a minimal yet strong enough government, which in turn speak of the importance we give or we should give to civil society and civil society organizations, and in this case, think tanks. So first off, I think we play or should play a very essential role in this fight we are fighting. Now, I would say that the two main challenges we face to have a better or greater impact in society are, one, we don't play the smart game, and two, we are not very good at building coalitions. What I mean by the first thing is that, so for instance, a very good friend of mine often says that stupid for Jesus is still stupid. Now, we are not in the business of fighting for the kingdom, but our kingdoms. But that it still applies or speaks to the fact that we are not very strategic on the way we conduct ourselves, we do our work. Content or research-wise, we should, of course, have a solid research. We should, of course, have an academic standard, yet a more common folk language to permeate society and penetrate politics. We are not doing that, or we often don't do that. So our research is not out there really. Also, format-wise, I often say to my colleagues that we get enough criticism, enough heat for the ideas we uphold. We cannot afford to get criticism on the way we do so, right? Also, we are not very good at timing sometimes. And also, we are not very good at conveying our messages to politicians and policymakers. What I mean by this is that sometimes we simply arrive late. We are not aware of the legal procedure, for instance, in Parliament, so we cannot really affect or impact lawmaking. Sometimes, and I'm not saying we should compromise, but sometimes I think it would be wiser for us to state our goal, but then come up with things that we can sell to political parties or policymakers because they can buy it, because they can in turn sell it to their voters. And we are not doing so very well. And when it comes to coalitions, there are a number of challenges ahead, but I'm taking so much time. Maybe I can address it later on.
Well, let me lead right to Marko, because you have experience with both lawmakers and coalitions and a think tank of your own. Talk about. I want to explore this relationship between think tanks and lawmakers. Now, you're a lawmaker, so how should think tanks approach? Let's say you didn't have a think tank. How would you want to be approached? What resources do you believe think tanks can have, and how best would they approach you to share ideas with you?
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the main problems, and that's why I started out in politics. We all have plans, but God laughs at those plans, right? So we can plan as much as we want, but God has different ideas for us. And that was the case with me. I never considered myself a politician in the sense of a front runner for the party or in some capacity, but I was always interested in politics since an early age. I wanted to do something for the community, for my country, to make it better, to make my local region better, and that's how I started in politics. So after that, people tried to push me into politics, and now I'm in the parliament. So I guess they succeeded, and I failed in some case. But the main reason why we started a think tank is that Croatia has a specific situation. We have 70% of our economy is intertwined with the government in some way. So it's a really big problem. It's a really big problem in terms of economic freedom, of liberties, and a think tank was basically a way for us to cooperate with people who don't want to be associated with political parties or against the government in some cases, to have them as experienced people with knowledge who could help us in promoting our goals in policy. So it has changed for me a bit since I'm in the parliament now, and actually there's a great example of this. We had a referendum against the euro in Croatia. We did quite good, and the main problem was that we couldn't find economists in Croatia who wanted to be upfront. Neven is one of them. He was truthful in terms of the situation in the Eurozone, but we had big problems, and everybody that's from Croatia knows this. People just don't want to be exposed because they're fearful of the backlash of the government. Their freedoms are jeopardized, their livelihood is jeopardized in some sense if they cross that border. We have economic think tanks who helped us, but they are so closely related with the government and with the financing from the government that it couldn't be widely known. It was all done under the table. So I see think tanks, particularly in Croatia, as a way to include people that want to be in politics, that want to promote certain topics, certain problems, but don't want to be exposed as much in terms of the media, PR, and everything else. So it's let's put it like a segue into politics in some sense in Croatia.
Stefan, I want to talk to you about ideology for a second. So we heard in the last panel there was it seemed like not an insurmountable divide among European conservatives. Talk about conservatism in Europe. I know in the United States, I see people who claim to be conservatives like a person consuming raw meat claiming that they're a vegetarian, right? There doesn't, to me, seem to be a philosophical coherence to calling yourself a conservative and the policies that are promoted. Free trade is one of them, okay? Do we have a similar divide in Europe, and how do we, is it fixable, is it breachable? Is there a unified purpose among conservatives in Europe, or is the gap just too big?
Right. Well, in Europe, it's a lot different situation than it is in the United States. And I see like Americans sometimes don't quite understand. What happens here in Europe, of course, is you have a lot of different ideologies who have their own parties, and they're, depending on which country they're in, the parties change a lot. So you don't have two parties competing in each country. You have a bunch of different parties, and depending on where you are, it's either going to be the Christian Democrats against the liberal whatever party. So there's a lot lot of options for Europeans, depending on where they fit. I think United States, if you fall within, right-wing ideology, be it social or be it economical, you're still gonna be in the Republican sort of sphere. That doesn't really happen in Europe. You can choose parties depending exactly on your principles. I don't think, when it comes to divide, I mean, you would know better, but I don't think it's as bad as United States when it comes between sort of the inner fighting between conservatives and liberals. There's a bit more cooperation, I think, especially on the European level. So I do think that the situation is different than the United States. I would call it better. I think European politics are currently more stable than those in the States. But as for, I'm not a conservative, so I don't really know what's going on inside of the movement. But we've seen, maybe in the last 10 years, we've seen sort of a rise of conservatism, especially populism. And that sort of then started going away in the last few years. So I'm not sure what's actually happening. I think that's a better question for him.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's one more big difference than it is with the States. I mean, think tanks are there. There are institutions now, and I think it's just starting in the last decade or so on the European level. But what the Americans need to understand that we're nations. We're small countries. We're not a federation. We don't want a federally arranged Europe, and this is something that my party and on the European and on the national level promote. And it's always a lot harder in terms of policy making, because every country has its own specifics. Everybody has its own culture. You can't have the same laws in Croatia as you have in Sweden or in the UK. It's just not possible. It's a different culture. But what we can do is learn from other countries. We had a few bills that we wanted to pass in the Croatian parliament that were German ideas, like the mini jobs in Germany, which were put into place by social democrats in Bavaria, and actually they put a neoliberal economy in power, but it worked. That's why Bavaria now in Germany is the forerunner in terms of economy. So those are things that we can learn from each other. I'm sure Croatia also has, let's say, tourism or other parts that other nations could learn from us. But I think what we need, and this is a great example of it, the think tank central, like we need to cooperate together. If we're in communication, it's much easier to learn from one another.
Can I just add something he said? I agree that in European politics, especially I guess on the Brussels level, the role of the NGOs and the lobbyist organizations hasn't, I think, been as strong or as public as it is in DC, and I think that's the big problem we're facing today as NGOs operating in Europe, trying to have the decision makers follow our advice or our guidelines. I don't think that connection is as strong as it should be. I don't think NGOs should be sort of begging the government to listen to them. I think it should be the other way. I think the government should be there to listen to the civil society and the civil sector, because that's where the ideas come from, and that's where you can get unbiased opinions and information. So I think as long as NGOs are going to Brussels and looking for a job, and not Brussels actually reaching out to these NGOs, we're not going to be taken as seriously as I think we should.
Juan, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, that last point speaks to the supply and demand issue. So on the one hand, when it comes to supply, it's evident that civil society is not as flourishing as in the Anglosphere, in continental Europe particularly. We are not that used to taking matters in our own hands and building private, independent things from bottom up. And it is also a demand problem, which also impacts the supply side of things, which is that political parties, both at the national level and the EU level, are not as used to asking for advice and policy recommendations from civil society agents, right? That's one thing. Now, when it comes to the state or the unity of conservatives, etc., in Europe, I think there are so few of us that the survival instinct kicks in at some point, and we tend to gather around certain topics, ideas, etc. And we don't need to. And that also links to what I mentioned earlier about coalitions. That doesn't mean that we have to agree on at an ideological level, or as a in a broader sense. We just need to agree sometimes on policy issues. That should be enough for now, in some respects. So, for instance, you just said you're not a conservative, right? So free market liberals and conservatives can agree on so many things. And when it comes to building coalitions, there are unexpected allies, right? So, for instance, say the pro-life movement will find an ally in some feminist tribes when it comes to the issue of surrogacy, for entirely different reasons, right? So pro-lifers will say that parents aren't entitled to having a child, but the children are entitled, or they have a right to a father and a mother. And some feminists, would argue that the female body is not for sale, is not to be subject to commercial or market needs, right? So, but in this point, they agree. So we should be, again, strategic enough to overcome our differences, which are huge in this respect, between pro-lifers and these radical feminists, because in this point in particular, we can agree on and we can show a united front to impact policy.
In the United States, we don't have politically attached think tanks we have political action committees, but they're very much focused on message. There's been a migration of think tanks that have moved from rigorous research, providing research for lawmakers to formulate policy, to things like Center for American Progress, which is actually more focused on talking points and messaging and going on television to repeat the Democratic Party lines. So when you have a think tank that's attached to a political party, I'm just curious, we have ideologically attached think tanks, so Heritage is conservative, and in fact the branding is actually so strong that many American politicians who are conservative, in order to look more conservative, they will affiliate with these think tanks. That's how strong the branding can be with Americans for Tax Reform or the Heritage Foundation or Cato or some of the others. I'm curious, how does that relationship work? Does it present challenges? And how do you hold your party members, your party's fairly new, accountable so that they don't become philosophical apostates?
Well, that's a challenge. That's for sure. I mean, the goal of these sort of organizations is to, obviously, to keep and also deepen into the ideological framework of on which the party emerged on the one hand, and at the same time, we are meant to not to play, obviously, but to experiment or to identify new trends, to identify the possible evolutionary roads of that ideological framework in face of new circumstances or new topics that arise, etc., and also to provide policy recommendations, not so much as to chase after MPs, right, that are playing a bit too much with ideas different from those of the party. So there is a challenge, I would say, from these type of organizations on two main fronts. One would be that we have it, on the one hand, very hard to do what we are supposed to do, which is to lead other non-partisan independent organizations which are aligned to our core values or that agree with us on specific policy issues. We should be we should do that. That's part of our DNA, I would say. And in that respect, we are meant to function as a meeting point of like-minded individuals and organizations. And this is an example of that sort of initiative, I would say. On the other hand, obviously, there is a political bias and there is a political brand in place. And that sometimes, hinders those possibilities we have to reach out to independent and non-partisan organizations. At the same time, this type of organizations can do a good job, which is what I just referred to, or a really poor job. And there is obviously the temptation of doing so, and a temptation that we have to resist as any temptation, which is not to provide the ideological framework and work on it and keep the course, so to speak, but to justify from the ideological realm decisions made by politicians, okay, and try to justify them by saying, which would be an intellectually dishonest work, that they align with this or that ideological framework. And that temptation obviously exists because, as we all know, politicians tend to live out of votes, right? And that means that they have, at the same time, the temptation of going to wherever those votes are, right? Instead of keeping the course when it comes to ideas, etc. And those would be the main challenges for a think tank which is that close to one single political party.
Marko, is populism a problem for you and ideological adherence at your think tank?
Yeah, it's always a problem in politics. Well, I come from a marketing background, so I can understand the tendency for think tanks to move into the space of PR firms and to, as you said, just put talking points on subjects and to prepare people for their media presence. But I think the studies that the think tanks do, I think they're very beneficial for politicians to understand what's going on behind the lines. A lot of politicians you just don't have the time in the day to get a subject, to get into it completely, because it's so fast-paced, and every day there are 2 or 3 main themes in your country or in the parliament or something else. So think tanks should be a mix of both, I think. I think that should be their main goal, is to get prepared, to have articles written, to have the studies done, but also to have an easy way to present it to the audience, because you can do the best job in the world. If you don't know how to present yourself or the idea, it doesn't mean anything. And perception is a big problem. Well, big problem, and the main catalyst in politics. So whatever you do, if you have perception of that you're doing it good, you're probably doing good. And that's the downfalls of politics, because sometimes we do really surface level stuff, and it is sometimes to get the votes. Sometimes you just want to say something. We know the politics in our country, so it's easy to say something about the Serbs, or the Serbs to tell something about the Croatians, and then you get a boost in the so which is the next president for
Works every time.
Yeah, sure. So that's the easy way out. Sorry, I just wanted to. So I think there is a codependence, and I think there should be a codependence in terms of politicians and the think tanks. But also there has to be a clear line in your values and in your pragmatism. The same is for politicians and for the think tanks. So I think it's a double-way street. You need this cooperation between each other, and of course take accountability and receive it right from the other side.
In 1994, in the United States, a backbencher in the Congress named Newt Gingrich had this idea that most Americans agreed with him on his philosophies. Conservative philosophies. He came up with a contract with America, was wildly successful, and he ushered the Republicans in, not only in the House, of which he was wanting to run for Speaker and became Speaker, but the Senate was ushered in as well. And he had claimed the Republican Party for so long had been guilty of a minority mindset, right? That this is just our lot. People don't agree with us. And so when I look around Europe today and I see so many countries dominated by liberals, and in your case, Juan, liberals and communists, it could be pretty bad and discouraging. Let me start with Stefan. Are European conservatives guilty of a minority mindset?
Well, first of all, I think there should be, as somebody who came from liberal background, when I started working for Students for Liberty, I became more libertarian, but I'm still leaning towards the left, especially when it comes to social issues. So I heard somebody, a director from the European Liberal Institute, which is a partner organization of ours, he said, I identify myself as a social libertarian. I like that. So when it comes to Europe, I think you have to make a distinction, especially for Americans, between liberals and socialists. There's liberals who, like me, are on economic issues, and when it comes to governance or small government principles, we agree with the conservatives. Then you have the socialists who don't, and they're sort of our adversary. When it comes to the question of, I guess, how conservatism is doing in Europe and if it has a minority mindset, I don't think so. I think Europe had been dominated by conservatives for a century or so. I think conservatives are pretty strong in Europe. You see that through elections in a lot of countries. The governments do switch sides every so often, not so much, I guess, in the United Kingdom or somewhere where there is a strong conservative history. But on mainland Europe, I think you can see that the population is sort of split. So you have, in most of the European countries, you have a strong conservative movement and you have a strong liberal or a socialist movement, and they're competing quite well. So I don't think conservatism in Europe is sort of on a backbench or trying to defend itself. So I think it's going.
Stefan, Marko, Stefan brought up the UK, which apparently announced the largest tax cut today in 70 years. So that's a positive. That's some positive news.
Yeah.
But what about the rest of Europe? Or do you think? Let me ask you it this way: where do you think voters are? Do you think that most voters are with us, conservative, but we haven't explained it right, we haven't introduced the right policies, we're not communicating correctly, we're not putting forth the right leader? What is it? They're just liberal and we're just going to have to live with it?
First of all, I think most of the voters are in the center. And that's the main difference between European countries and the States, or the UK, because you have that third option in countries in Europe, and I think in today's political climate, I think it's hard to have a government without the centrists. Even though I never understood what does it mean to be a centrist. I mean, for me, it's just a person who doesn't have their values completely defined, because
You mean conservatism is in the center?
Well, it is in one foot, but the center that I'm talking about are the undefined politicians who are not sure if they want a smaller government or a bigger government. They're somewhere in between. They don't have their ideas clear, and it's always easier for them because you can always play on both sides, right? So it's much easier to communicate some stuff. Well, if you take Croatia as an example, we supposedly have a center-right party in government. But if you look at their policies and the laws that they are producing, it's no different than the Social Democrats in Croatia. So I think it is more complex in terms of Europe, especially in the eastern parts of Europe, Croatia, Serbia, Poland, Hungary. We all had a socialist past, and I think in Croatia, I'll talk about Croatia, but I think the mindset is still there, and it takes time, it takes generations So like Moses went through the desert for 40 years, not because he couldn't find his way out of the desert. He wanted the mindset to change from slaves, so that the new generations understood that they are not slaves anymore, that they didn't have that complex in their head. So I think it will take time, but I think conservative ideas or economical, what have you, in terms of policy, I think they will come up as the logical solution to most things. But I think we're currently losing a battle against the left. Fortunately, we're like 10 years behind the States, so what's happening now in the States, I think it'll come to Croatia in 10 years' time, but it's an ongoing battle, and we just had to be stubborn-headed to see it through, you know.
Might I add, I think when we're talking about this, I think it's important to understand that, at least in Europe, in most parts of Europe, people, you're saying centralists are politicians who don't really have a philosophy. Well, they're preaching to the voters who don't have political principles themselves. They don't care about politics. They are not gonna say I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, whatever. They're voting not based on ideas. They're voting based on what the politicians who are running are saying their policies want to be, and if they like them, they like them. But they don't have, I don't think in Europe we have that sort of connection between the parties and the majority of the population. I think in the United States, most people, if you ask them if you're Democrat or Republican, they'll answer you one or the other. I don't think that really exists in Europe. You have supporters of parties, of course, but those are a very small minority. The rest of the people will vote for whomever they like, and they'll vote for one party 1 year, and in 3 years they'll vote for somebody else. So I think that's sort of what you always have to take into account in Europe, is that people aren't that connected with the parties in parliament.
I agree with that insofar as the vote in Europe, or in Western Europe in particular, is increasingly so more of a sociological vote than an ideological one. Precisely because of that, what conservatism is offering, increasingly so, is a common sense set of policies, really, and that's appealing to the public. I would disagree with Stefan in respect to the fact that conservative parties have had a good run of these past few decades. I would argue that traditional conservative parties in Europe, that has been the case, for instance, in my country, Spain, with the People's Party, have transitioned to more social democrat stance on anything, really. So it is kind of newcomers in the political arena, the ones presenting true conservative postulates and reaching out to the sociological votes as well as the ideological one, and especially when it comes to social conservatism, because the left abandoned the working class in the 60s, really, when they thought that because of the emergence of the middle class and the weakness of the USSR, etc., that the working class would be non-existent, wouldn't be a thing in the near future. So they went on to find new collectives, really, to bring the dialectic Marxist dynamic to them, and that's how identity politics came into existence, right? But now the working class, as it happens, still exists. They are disenfranchised, really, in Europe and elsewhere. And they happen to be also socially conservative, with strong family values, etc. And I think conservative parties that are, smart enough to capitalize that vote will do just fine.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the socialists gave up, as you said, on the working class. They found a new messiah, and that's the green policies. So they used to protect the working class, the proletariat, right? And So today we can see them as the defenders of the world. So they're defending from climate change, and they want to see themselves as saviors. And it's really a good thing for them, because then there are no boundaries, there are no countries. We're just protecting the whole world. And some of the policies, as we all know, are ludicrous, because of course climate is changing. No, I'm not denying it, but they don't want common sense arguments in how to change that. They want to change the way of life that we live. So if you tell them, well, we can preserve our way of life if we build nuclear clean energy, but that's not an option for them, because we have to change. That's their main goal. I think it's just shifted from the working class to new policies, and I think the green agenda is one of them.
Let me shift gears a little bit. Let me paraphrase Winston Churchill a little bit. He was the one, I think, who originated the idea that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. That's been repeated by many politicians. Milton Friedman talked about sometimes when you get substantive change, and he was talking about economic policy, you have to wait for a crisis to occur so that the political environment lines up. But it is important for think tanks, and in his case, the University of Chicago and the other economic think tanks at the time, that would have policies ready for when these crises emerge. I want to ask you and get your thoughts. When Putin illegally invaded Ukraine, were the European conservatives think tanks ready? Did they have a response? Did we get it right, or did we miss the mark?
Can I actually take this just for a... yes and no. I think Eastern European conservatives did a very strong response, because they've been alluding to it for years, that this is going to happen. And when the war's been going on since 2014. When the invasion happened, you can see that the ruling parties, conservative parties in Poland, as well as the rest sort of of the NATO shield, they were the first ones to react. Whereas I think Western European conservative parties weren't as much. I think there's been, again, going back to sort of the nationalism and populism movements, they have sort of entered into the conservative politics in Europe. A lot of those parties ended up being somewhat caught between their relationships with Moscow and trying to react to this situation, which now they have to be against Moscow. There was no really going back, especially by April or May, by May when it became apparent that this isn't really going to be a war that Russia can win. So I think when it comes to Eastern European conservative parties, I think they did a great job. That was the first time I actually agreed with like the Polish government. I was like, oh, these guys are actually, I really like what they're doing. I think this was the right response. Western European, I'm not sure. They've caught up by now, but there's, I think there's still problems when you look at what's happening with German politics and how they're sort of still not being able to come up with principles when it comes to how they deal with Ukraine. I think that's sort of an ongoing problem, but that's also the true for the more far left
Mark?
parties.
Juan?
I wouldn't say it is sometimes the relation with Moscow on the part of Western European think tanks that prevented them from being ready, but the fact that they said or refused to believe that their national interest lied on that conflict, these far away, etc. That they had, better things to do, and they would turn their backs on the conflict and the repercussion of the conflict on their own national interests. Now, earlier on, I spoke of timing and lack of timing when it comes to the work of think tanks, and I do believe that in the case of the Russian invasion, as well as many other things, we think tankers, unfortunately, are reacting to the political and news cycle, which is hectic, really, rather than being proactive and being ready, as you said.
Yeah,
I know that you're familiar with the history in the Balkans, and there must be some lessons here, some familiarity here. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a paste template of our homeland war in Yugoslavia. When I say homeland, I mean in Croatia. It's called homeland, but Yugoslav wars, as it's known in broader terms, there's a very, very similar in terms of I would say, if you remove the names of Ukraine and Russia. You could see the copy-paste with the referendum initiatives we had in Croatia, the occupied territories. We had a bit of a more struggle because we had an embargo on weapons in Croatia. But coming back to like the think tanks and the readiness in terms of the aggression, I'm not sure that I saw anything except a few Polish think tanks who were. Well, Kaczynski was saying it in 2009, I think, that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. And in 2014, we saw that with Crimea. 14, sorry, in Crimea. So it's complicated. I think the quote is quite good because, let's say, the other crisis that we had was COVID. And if you look at Croatian laws at the time, there was no option for anybody to work from home. So if you wanted to work from home, you had to have a fire extinguisher in your room and two doors that you could go out on each side. So it wasn't possible. It showed all the flaws in our judicial system, and it was the right opportunity to have a reform in terms of the judicial system, in terms of the administration, which is far too big in Croatia, but it never happened. And I think the main problem in those terms is the status quo of the governing party, who doesn't want to abolish their power in terms of their influence in the society. But I'll agree with Juan. It's a problem. We're reacting. We're not proactive, and to be proactive, you have to put your agenda forward. You have to be the front runners in terms of putting the topics in front. And for that, I think we need this coalition between, as you said, partners on certain topics, but also a coalition between the think tanks and the politicians. And when you have that, then you can put topics in front, the ones that you think that need to be promoted more.
Also, I mean, this is not easy, right? Because you know, being willing and delighted to collaborate doesn't prevent us from having, at some point in time, conflicting national interests. That's one thing. Second, I would argue that an international conservative order is still to be developed, or articulated intellectually, and moreover implemented, right? So we are seeing the demise of the international liberal order being, you know, either absolutely flawed or perfectly executed, depending on where you stand regarding the international liberal order. But we don't have a response from a conservative perspective as to the way the international order should be arranged, and therefore respond to these sort of conflicts that arise. And that's still to be seen. And I believe that it's one of our tasks ahead.
Stefan, you work with an enormous number of young people, students, and so give us some hope. What are the
There
trends?
is hope.
What are the trends with students today?
I work for an organization that that recruits students who do have political motivations, that do have a strong ideological sense. So I can only speak of those who represent sort of the best of their generation in a sense. The students that we're getting now are, I think when we started off as an organization in Europe, so we started in the United States as a libertarian youth organization. When we moved to Europe, of course, that had to be adjusted, simply because being a libertarian in Europe, really, that's a very, very, very small minority. But I still think that up until a few years ago, most of the students that were coming into the program did consider themselves either libertarian or some sort of anarchists, or more leaning towards conservatism. That has somewhat changed now. We get more students that would consider themselves liberal, which I like. But it's still, the majority of the students that we do get are still would consider themselves to be on the conservative side. And when you ask them what are sort of the main issues that they see in the world, it's small government, it's about taxes, it's about immigration. And so I think the future is bright for the conservative movement if I'm basing it off of the students that we are getting. So I do think that there's hope for the future in a sense that this new generation, or my generation really, I don't think we sort of want to wait for our turn. We don't want to run the world when we are in our 50s. We want to run it now. We're not very pleased with the current order of things. And so I think you see a lot more young people today than before who are going out there and making changes and trying to become the decision makers a lot earlier in life than you would traditionally consider it. And I like that. And that's across the board, I think. So I do like this current generation, and I do think there's going to be a lot of great things coming out, and sort of a renewal of a real political debate in our society in the coming years because of the young people who are actively trying to change things, be it in their country, be it on a European level, US level. I mean, the youth in the United States has sort of changed the whole political system. You know, we spoke about wokeness and this and that. Well, all of that sort of came from people in their 20s, and now everybody's talking about it. So I think that's sort of an important thing to understand and sort of to get prepared so we don't get caught again without a plan is how do we integrate the young people better. Somebody mentioned at one of the panels, you know, we use young people to get them into our organization so they can learn stuff. I think that's sort of a good way to get this massive resource is to get young people as soon as you can and mentor them and nourish them because they are not going to wait until they're in their later part of life to decide, oh, I'm going to run for election. No, they'll run at 25, 26. We've seen it. I have alumni organization that, got elected into offices at 24, 25 years old. And that's impressive. And so I do think there's definitely hope.
Marko?
Being a relatively young man, I'm afraid of what you just said. Because I do believe you have to have experience to run things, especially... I'm not sure I would give myself in my 20s my car now that I think of it the way I acted in my 20s, right? So if I saw myself, I wouldn't give myself my car. So I think this is a cultural problem that has changed our society. We have to do everything fast. If you're not a millionaire by 30 or 25, you're not a success, you're a failure. If you're not in the parliament by 25, something's wrong with you. And I think a lot of it has to do with social media, with the climate that we're in, because it's easy to look at somebody's photos who's, I don't know, so we're in Estonia, I put a picture with a beer and my life is great, right? So, but that's the surface level. Nobody's digging into the problems in our country, and I think we need time. Of course, we need young people, but because that's the new blood that's pushing us forward. But I would be terrified if they took over in 2025.
So Juan, are you optimistic about the young future, or are you already a curmudgeon like Mark? No, just kidding, Marko.
No. But I mean, I'm still in my 20s for a few months at least, and obviously, I mean, the future will be ours. But it will be ours no matter what. And I'm hesitant as to what the future looks like, meaning that there is consensus that nobody likes the current situation, right? but there is a great divide as to what we should do about it. What we are seeing in the US is some sort of, for instance, abolition of Western values. So they seem obsessed with the fact that the US is systemically racist and etc. Right? So this is like having a crew wishing to ship off, right, to depart, no matter the destiny, without thinking of the consequences of abolishing the current state of things. They are not giving that much thought to the things that should change and the things that shouldn't. And it is fairly possible that their future is way worse than the current situation. So in other words, the younger generations are always or will be activated, engaged politically. I'm not that sure as to the direction they or we lead us.
Let me bring it back to think tanks. So let's stick with the optimism.
Okay.
And
So with me, basically.
money's not an object, and you can design the future of think tanks. What does it look like in 10 years? What would you like to see? What changes would you like to see? The think tanks are more effective, more cooperative, or anything you want. Like, what do you think about on a daily basis? What am I working toward? How do I want to develop my think tank to be in the future?
It's fairly hard to think of that future of a future where money is not a problem, is not an issue. But let's talk fictionally then for a minute. So I would say to have having a landscape of think tank which are specialized in policy areas, etc. Besides those who work on ideas or political philosophy, that would be a good combination. To having a political landscape at the same time, not that hungry to monopolize or to hire or simply pay off think tanks to provide them with policy or to control them essentially, and use them as communication tools, really, to reach out to society as a whole. So I would like to see that division between civil society and politics, so that civil society can play its role, its legitimate role as a healthy balance and counterweight to politics, right? I'd like to see a political landscape humble enough to ask for advice from civil society.
To be forced.
Or forced to some extent. And if money is not a problem, and money doesn't come, because we are thinking of non-partisan think tanks in this case, if money is not a problem and money doesn't come from politics, that means that it comes from society. And that's a very healthy thing to think of or to dream of, especially when it comes to continental Europe, because that hasn't been the case. It hasn't been the case that conservatives who happen to have the greater wealth in Europe still, okay, when it comes to properties, etc., that they bet on their own ideas, putting some skin in the game by pouring money to civil society organizations, NGOs, etc. That hasn't been the case, but I would like to see that fictional world we are speaking of, because that means that society has awoken finally.
Yeah, so if we move away the main problem, which is financing, I think it's three things: clear values, independence from the state, and influence. So I think that's if that's the holy trinity. If the financing is done right, so. As you said, if it's societally funded, of course, you have the independence from the state, which is great. The influence today is, as you said at the beginning, a lot of politicians want to be with heritage, with the Cato Institute leadership. It doesn't matter which one, but it's a brand that when you put it next to a name, it means something. It gives value to the person that's next to it. So I think that's very important in terms of think tanks, and in order to have that sort of branding and that sort of influence, you need to do good work. So I think those are the main 3 points, and hopefully it will come someday.
I think we have time for one question from the audience. If we've got a question, wait for the microphone to come to you. Any questions? Yes.
I actually have one, and it sounds like it's the elephant in the room. Funding. You expressed.
The
So
gentleman.
yes, the question is about money. All three of you seem to express frustration as not having your ideas heard by the government, by those who rule. Isn't that where the money comes from in Europe? So you're saying those who fund you don't care what you think?
So
not enough.
this was actually going to be one of my points for this panel. In Europe, most of the money for NGOs does come from the governments. So I guess you'll know. So in the Balkans, you have massive amounts of money coming from U.S. aid through the State Department, as well as massive amounts of money coming through the EU projects. And most of the NGOs that I know of, that are local, meaning they operate primarily in one country. That's where the money comes from. It comes from EU or US governments, or it comes from the local governments. Like in Serbia, you can see any sort of a project in Serbia, any sort of like a conference, a bigger conference in Belgrade, and if you look at the sponsors, it's always the same three. It's going to be US aid, EU projects, and the Serbian Ministry of whatever it is. And that's a problem. I don't think NGOs, be it think tanks, be it watchdog organizations especially, should be taking money from the government. I think that makes you complicit. Because you take money from a government that maybe your NGO agrees with. I mean, governments do change, but let's say for a while there's a government in place whose values are the same as your NGOs. Well, that's perfect until they mess up. And now you're supposed to criticize them because that's, part of your job, and you can't do it because the money and the influence is coming from them. Well, that's very
Let me just hold it. I got 1 minute left. Juan, I know you want to weigh in, and we're going to end it there.
I mean, with funding, there are things that come attached, right? So it's a whole package. There are certain things that come with that funding coming downstream from government or EU institutions, etc. Therefore, it would be desirable, way more desirable to get money from society. That being said, one could also make the case, and I'm, to be honest, doubtful about this. One could make the case that the money is going to be spent. It's just taxpayers' money, actually. So you're contributing to this. So that money is going to be spent. You can choose to either use it in your own benefit or in the benefit of your ideas and to advance your cause, or to be used by your ideological opponents, right? But no matter what, it's going to be spent. Now, the question really is, does accepting money from these sort of organizations prevents you from campaigning to end that sort of funding, massive funding with strings attached? Does it make you a hypocrite? Does it make you incoherent? One could make the case again that you can ask for money if offered, and at the same time ask for fewer government spending on these sort of things.
Okay, we are out of time. Please thank my panel.